Hi there, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Speaking of. My name is Steve Weissman. I'm the InfoGov guy, and I'm really excited today to be joined by our special guest, Joshua Crumbaugh. He's the founder and CEO of PhishFirewall. He has a background as an ethical hacker, which really piqued my interest because he has lived through and helped remediate, I imagine, many of the issues that we face as information professionals. So I've invited Joshua here to talk to us, the view from the dark side, if you will, and tracing it backwards through to what could have been done differently with the information in our care to prevent or at least reduce the disaster that then ensued. How's that for a setup? Joshua, welcome. Maybe you can do yourself a little more credit than I have, just summing up your background, but if you could tell a little bit more and we'll get right into it.
Yeah, so I'm Joshua Crumbaugh, and like you said, I came from an ethical hacking background. I spent the better part of 20 years breaking into some of the most secure facilities in the world. During that time, went on to run some of the top teams and or some of the top red teams across the country, and so that really gave me a passion for more than anything, the human side of cybersecurity, where, the human error, how do we fix that? Because at the end of the day, we know what to do on the non-human side. It's the human side, whether it's data or email or really any any aspect of cybersecurity where things continuously fail. And so that's where I put my focus in my career, and the reason I founded PhishFirewall is to address that human error that is so common in cybersecurity.
Well, I think, well, first, again, I really appreciate you taking the time out. It's a perspective we don't always get, at least not firsthand. And I think you really just put your finger on what I see as one of the major issues, which is the human side. And it's not even necessarily because people have evil intent. They're just trying to get their work done. And so they end up storing things in places where maybe it shouldn't be stored because they can't get access to the system of record, or that today the connection is down. I had one client years ago at a utility. Turned out as he was going out to where the power stations were in the field, he was having trouble getting to his email. So he copied his entire Outlook PSD file to Dropbox, I think it was. And of course, when the information governance person got involved and found this out, she about fainted.
Can't imagine why.
So I think you're right. We do know what to do, certainly on the technology side. I think it's fair to say we also know what to do on the human side, but it too often doesn't translate. Would you agree with that? And maybe you have some dark tales of woe to tell on that score.
Well, I mean, I think in some ways, I think it's more we have the resources to know what to do on the human side, but more often than not, we ignore them. And what I mean by that is human error is a psychology problem, a communications problem, far more than it is a cybersecurity problem. Now, yes, it results in these cybersecurity incidents and breaches, but if you don't understand the behavioral science of how people learn and how to communicate with people, you're going to be very ineffective at communicating why it's so important to secure or to store your files in, locations that are managed by the information security team, or why it's so important that you don't copy your PST file up to Dropbox. Or the more common one, why it's so critical that you don't use that USB drive to copy all of your work files onto it and then go over to work at a coffee shop where you may forget about it or accidentally drop it. And so I think, yes, we do know, because there's been a lot of research put into particularly adult communications focused on and around the workplace. And so, we have a lot of those resources, but My opinion, and it's my opinion, is that the information security community as a whole has really failed to incorporate or adopt these, proven behavioral science principles into their communications planning.
Can you give us an example of what some of those principles are, so that perhaps, the folks watching this, if they're not getting it from their security, professionals, I'll use the air quotes, I'm not ashamed, that they might be able either to ask for it or build it into their own programs?
Yeah, I mean, there's countless ones, but I think one of the biggest mistakes that we make is we tend to have a punitive approach toward a lot of our cybersecurity programs. You made a mistake, so I'm going to slap your hand or I'm going to demean you. Not literally, but what is the first thing we learn when we get into cybersecurity? It's, well, the user is the problem. And we learn about all these fun little acronyms like the ID10T error and PEBCAC. And we learn these phrases like you can't patch stupid. And it leads to this animosity. And I've heard so many people that are new to cybersecurity, they've been in it just long enough to make it to a senior position, but not long enough to realize the business use cases around stuff. And so you get this mentality of, this is my network, it's my way or the highway, and that's not how business is done. And so I think that's one example. And I've quite literally seen and continue to see massive corporations around the world, and in particularly in the United States, who are heavily punitive in their approaches to trying to mitigate human error. I recently gave a talk at actually in Colorado. Recently, I guess it was a year ago, because I'm going back to that conference next week. But while I was there, I gave a talk about just the behavioral psychology, and one of the things I talked about was how you have to be very kind and your approach, and use more carrots than sticks. And I specifically called out the 3 strikes and you're out policies around phishing. And I had somebody come up to me after the conference and they say, my company does that. And this was no small company. They worked for American Express, and they continue to tell me how they have, people in their organization that are so afraid to check their email that they can't even get people to respond when they're trying to email around between the company. That is sort of the opposite of the type of approach that we need. There's this thing called learned helplessness that tends to kick in. And so that's just one example of where we're forgetting about the behavioral science. The other example is when educating people about the dangers of unstructured data, the dangers of storing things on USB drives or in Dropbox that's not managed, or different things like that, or even just locally on your machine.
Right.
When we talk to people about this, we're often making things too complicated. We spend many, many minutes just getting to the point about why we're there, and we've already lost them before we tell them why. And more importantly, we get into the weeds, and we do it naturally because we are technical people. We live in the weeds. But for the average person, they're going to have a very difficult time understanding it. And so the communications are typically lost on deaf ears.
You have said multiple mouthfuls there. Is that a thing? It is now.
It is now.
Gosh, I love the kindness approach. There is a fellow by the name of Louis Eisen. Hi, Louis. Who has made as his mission, I'll say, when it comes to writing policies to govern various information-based processes. It's Canadian, so they're processes there. To take a kinder, gentler approach, and a lot less of, don't do this, but please do that. And when I first heard it from him, goes back a number of years now, I was really taken by that. you catch more flies with honey than I forget the rest of that. Um, I don't like flies or honey. So it's interesting to hear it coming kind of from a different direction, because it does boil down to the basics of human psychology. And for many years, I've thought about printing a bumper sticker that says, "This is psychology. This isn't technology," because it's all
Yeah.
about the systems work by and large these days. So every time I get a client or talk to someone at a conference who said, yeah, we tried this information governance thing, it didn't work very well. It's like, well, I bet it did, but I bet you didn't either think it through fully at the beginning, or it wasn't really communicated clearly, or in the terms that somebody could understand in their own terms. So I talk in terms of, when it comes to explaining this stuff, you want to have people understand and believe this isn't being done to them, but for them. And we spend so much time talking about the risk. You have to mitigate risk, non-compliance, fines, subject access requests from a privacy standpoint. You e-discovery, you don't want to get sued. There is a plus side to this stuff too. And part of my mission lately is to try to unearth more of that. And it's can be challenging to do in terms of hard dollar savings, although you can. But there are efficiencies to be gained and creativity to be fostered if people aren't afraid. As you say, they don't even email back because I don't want to do something wrong. I talk about, I don't remember the real name of this, but I describe it as the trained flea syndrome. Would you like to hear the trained flea syndrome?
Oh, I'd love to.
If you put a bunch of fleas in a jar, apparently, they try to jump out. If you put a lid on the jar, they still try to jump out, but they bump their little heads on the jar, on the lid. So they stop jumping that high. If you then take the lid off, they don't jump out. They only jump as high as they jumped when the lid was still on, because of the fear of bumping their little heads. I have anthropomorphized them, but it's what I think it's what you just described.
Yeah. No, I mean, I agree. Learned helplessness is something that we found. It's more on the phishing side. I don't know that it would apply to data governance. But I see that as very similar to what would describe what's happening with those fleas, right? Where you have people that are really, really proud of their abilities around something, like, you can't catch me. I can spot a scam a mile away. And then the IT team, uses some inside information on phishing, which maybe the bad guys do too, but they do it, in enough times that this person goes from, oh, I can spot any scam, to, well, apparently I suck at this, and they give up and they stop trying. And they actually get worse as a result. And there's been a lot of academic studies that have found that some of our training makes people less effective, not more effective.
That's really interesting. So it ends up being counterproductive.
Yeah. There's been a number of academic studies recently that talk specifically about how the traditional approach to training has zero return on investment at all. And a few that even their studies indicated that people got less secure after the training as opposed to more secure. Regardless of which side of the camp you're on, they're all really coming out with the same findings. Traditional training doesn't work, and it either has no impact or potentially a negative impact. And that, I think, is the takeaway across all aspects of cybersecurity, is that we have to simplify our training when working with users. And when we tell them about why data security or hovering before they click or whatever it happens to be, but why it's so important, we've got to do it in a way that relates to them, that connects to them. And the example I like to give is that people don't want to hear, listen, before you use a thumb drive, you need encryption or whatever, right? They love to hear about what happens when Sally from HR used a thumb drive and forgot it at a coffee shop. That story communicates with them, it connects with them, and it makes that whole subject much more understandable and relatable to them. And now when you talk about, hey, you need to make sure that you're using thumb drives securely, you can just point them to IT, who can handle the technical, and allow them and give them a safe way to do it, or tell them, hey, you can't ever do it. But it's a different approach. And I think we need to bring storytelling back into what we do, because stories really do communicate. And when I look at the most effective content online, whether it's like blogs and stuff like that, and even our influencers that go viral every time they post. Well, what do they post? What is the formula? They tell stories. People love stories.
Yeah, that's really well put. And I think you're exactly right. They want to, if we're talking about them like they're these, same species, different day. What resonates for me, and I think for everybody, is I want to hear it from someone who is like me. And old marketing terms, you would talk about developing personas, and you have messages that appeal. I think all of that applies. My two sub bullets for organizational change are, it's the psychology, not technology piece. Well, I guess there are three, because that's one. Change management is marketing, and change management is parenting. How do you get people to do things that is good for them that they don't really want to do? So as adults, fine. You don't want to eat your vegetables or clean your room? Fine. But you have to take better care, or at least be more cognizant of security and private. I'm kind of lumping them all together, but when it comes to sensitive information in particular, you have to be more present as you do things, not to stop doing the things, because it doesn't mean you're doing it wrong, but to be reminded periodically that, we haven't talked to you about this in a year. It's still important.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, that's part of the reason I am a massive advocate of continuous awareness training. I would much rather spend 1 minute of my team's time every single week of the year than 60 minutes once a year.
Yes.
And I think that's another one of the ways we have to start looking at it, is we don't have to do things the way they've always been being done. And the fact that the most popular phrase in our entire industry is, well, you can't patch stupid. That tells me we have yet to figure out how to do it. And maybe we need to change the formula a little bit. Because the famously attributed quote to, I want to say, Einstein, the definition of insanity. I don't think it's actually him that made it, but regardless, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results.
Right. Yep.
Well, that is what we're doing in cybersecurity, and you look, there's all these new startups, and there's just boilerplate copies of the next one and the next one, and without much innovation. And that is what really excites me about the changes that AI is bringing to the marketplace. Is I really think maybe finally we're going to see a little bit more innovation and change, and just a new way of doing things around cybersecurity that hopefully is more effective. Because honestly, it has to be, because the bad guys have already figured out new ways of doing things using AI. So we do too.
We're always, almost by definition, a step behind. It's like, I've had this conversation in the past. Is there a way to get ahead of it? And I'm not sure there is. And speaking of forgetting whole phrases, but something along the line, we have to check every single door and window, and they just have to find one.
Yeah, we have to be right 100% of the time. They only have to be right once.
Right, there you go. That's why you're here.
No, I've heard that phrase more than one time, for sure.
Yeah, well, but only because it's true.
It is. It is.
Can you take a moment and expand a little bit on the role AI will play in helping to further secure the doors and windows and crawl spaces?
Yeah, I think AI is particularly these large language models when stacked with like a neural network, also known as deep learning. Um, I really truly believe that solutions like that are the future of cybersecurity. What it gives us the ability to do is to intelligently review large amounts of data, whether that is the use case like what we're doing at PhishFirewall, and that is using AI to create a cyber security or AI cyber coach that works with each and every user on an individual basis to
Hmm.
help them get better at detecting and avoiding common cyber threats. If it's more along the side of protecting your perimeter, we have to be perfect about that too. And so, one of the issues that has always been a problem with vulnerability and patch management as a whole is the fact that there's so much data that needs to be gone through and such a minimal time frame, and it makes it difficult to prioritize. What do I need to fix now, and what can wait? If I can only fix 10 things this week, I may have to prioritize if I have 1,000 items that need to be remediated. And so I see AI as being able to help better identify those types of issues around our networks, and B, being able to help us very quickly understand and triage that risk. And so I do see a lot of that. And then on the SIM side, I mean, historically, SIMs and even DLP tools have been so lousy with false positives that
Hmm.
they haven't been as much value as they should. And so, what does the SIM become? The system of record that sits there until we have an incident and we have to go look at it. I see AI making SIMs a lot more proactive to the point where they are much, much better at detecting. And we've already seen that a little bit over the past few years with more and more machine learning being integrated into these. So I'm excited to see where the future will hold. Regardless of what direction it goes, I will say that I think the possibilities are endless, and it's not just about sifting through large amounts of data. We were able to train a large language model on how to detect the underlying psychological triggers that are used in phishing attacks. And so like the indicators of attack, they are typically very technical or technically driven, and they change constantly. And so it's been a little bit of a moving target to try and write these, definitions
Hmm.
that help us block malicious email from getting in. Well, what we realized is that the psychology is the one thing that never changes. Across every fish, there's only a handful of cognitive biases that are used, about 50 of them. And so, you can catch 99.99% of phishing and a lot of the spam just by watching for those cognitive biases that are being used. So, I think we're only beginning to scratch the surface, and there's going to be a lot of other novel approaches to solving the same old problem. Sort of like that, but in different aspects of cybersecurity. I think in your industry, understanding the data is going to be a big thing. We've never had an AI that could look at the data and understand it and give some sort of ranking about how sensitive it is until now. I mean, yeah, it could look for credit card numbers or maybe some health information. But how does it understand the business sensitive data?
Hmm. Hmm.
Like, if you're in SaaS, your customer list is one of your most protected bits of data. But if that's exposed, chances are there's not, my DLP tool is not going to identify and trigger on that.
And one of my favorite examples from recent days, back in some ways to the psychology thing and the need for better or at least different kinds of training. It was one organization I was working with, and a typical project here, whether it's a maturity assessment of where they are in terms of their information governance practices, or we're helping to remediate something, or it a key part is to talk to representative people from all around the organization, or at least within the scope. Maybe it's department by department, depending on the size and all that. We were told relatively recently by someone Oh, you don't have to talk to that group. They told us they're using Salesforce specifically because it doesn't contain any personally identifiable information.
That's
And
it.
I
Okay,
thought,
that's funny.
and yeah, and I may have even said out loud, if you're using it right, that's pretty much all it contains. Never
I would
mind, people are
agree.
putting
I would
contracts in there when
agree.
they shouldn't. What?
I mean, even just phone number, address, at minimal, the phone number. And I make sure that I have mobile numbers on every record I have in Salesforce, or at least every one I possibly can. And if I can get their personal email address, that too, personal mailing address, all of those
All of
things.
those
So,
things. It's relationships, right? So, like, oh, your wife's birthday, or your anniversary, or your child's graduation date, anything. Anyway, I don't have to further belabor that point, but yeah, my reaction was very much what yours was.
yeah.
All right, so we've been yakking for a while, and again, I appreciate your time. Um, maybe we can count this as the last question, at least for today, and that's my not so subtle. Could we keep the conversation going in the months ahead? Would be awesome if you're amenable.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely.
given, let me find the beginning of this thought. My followers are used to this. I start in the middle and then I work towards both ends.
I do the same thing. So I can tell we'll get along.
Yeah. So if we put the information back in the center, given your experience, the things that you've seen, dealt with, helped fix, are there particular avenues that the viewers and listeners here should be aware of? In other words, sorry to be so inarticulate. People are used to that too. So, like, do you see more of USB drives going awry, or phishing attacks that people fall for, or out and out hacking, which my instinct tells me is probably further down the list, maybe than some of these others? Is it, can you even roughly rank order how common some of these fault
Yeah,
lines may be?
I think the most common, I guess, area where we see breaches around data right now, particularly data governance issues, is with what we call consent phishing. So, consent phishing is a little bit different than what most people are used to. The typical phishing attack is going to ask you to type in your credentials, or it's going to try and get you to run some malware or give up some sensitive bit of information. In this case, it is just pretending to be Microsoft or and asking you to authorize. And we've all done it. We all do it probably almost daily, where we have a authorization screen pop up. We click authorize. It tells us what the permissions are, and we move on. Well, a lot of people don't necessarily read or even necessarily know how to read those permissions. And so the bad guys have caught on to that, and they realize they have more access to the data of particularly within a person's email account, but also within SharePoint and OneDrive and things like that through the API than they do through a traditional account, and that they're way more or less likely to get caught, and that they are able to bypass MFA and all of this. And so they just get you to click authorize, and then they're in behind the scenes. The number one area I've seen this go really, really wrong is around a ton of sensitive data being sent via email without it being encrypted. We've been talking about this for well over a decade, well, close to 3 decades now. And I mean, talking 3 decades in the commonplace. It's been being talked about in the government sector for much longer than that. And almost 80, 70 years now. Anyway, no, 80. But regardless of that, we continue to email around sensitive data and credit card numbers or social security numbers or health information. Or one time we found a bank vault, a combination to a bank vault being emailed around. Another time we found one combination to a bank vault under somebody's keyboard. One time we found the press and media credentials to a famous professional sports team on a wide open share. All of these things can very, very quickly lead to issues. So I'd say that's number one. Number two is USBs. We still see it constantly. I had a client just a couple months ago. They come to me and they say, hey, we just had somebody turn in a USB drive and it has a ton of our information on it. And they're like, well, what do we do? I'm like, you have to assume a breach. This was gone for an unknown amount of time. Somebody that you don't even know showed up and brought it back to you. But we don't know what happened in between this. You have to assume a breach. And so we continue to see the USB drives as a key, source for data breaches. And I mean, I'd say those are the two biggest ones, but certainly by all means, not the only offenders. Sure. I mean, I still see in people's personal shares a lot of Excel spreadsheets with passwords in them. And we finally got IT teams to mostly stop doing that. And I say mostly because we still see it. But we haven't got finance, HR, or any other department to stop doing that. And it's particularly troublesome when it comes to finance, because more often than not, they will have passwords to some sensitive bank accounts in there.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And we didn't actually set this up, but it's a wonderful way to end this particular episode, because right there is why I do, and our viewers and listeners do what we do, and try to talk about information governance in the broadest sense. All kinds of information, regardless of location, format, media type, geography, whatever silo it's in, and to do it throughout the organization. I'm realistic, I hope, enough not to be pursuing 100% coverage, because I don't think that's attainable. And that's where we get back to the maturity modeling and all that, where are the biggest pain points. But if you can go from even 40 or 50% comfort level to 75, that's what is that worth?
It's worth a lot. I mean, when we calculate the return on investment for our customers, one of the things that we look at is, because we can never completely eliminate the risk of a breach. So we look at how long, given statistically, will it take for you to have a breach based on, the amount of risk we've reduced. And so we're looking at, well, right now you should have a breach on average every 14 months we can get it down up to 20 years, 30 years.
Right.
And that really reminds me of a book that I read by Win Schwartau called Analog Security. And it was really, one of the core points was about how we try to treat cybersecurity like it's binary. It's all ones or zeros. But the reality is it's analog. We're either trying to drive as close to one or as close to zero as possible, but we're never truly going to achieve one or zero. And so he talked about how we have to change our view of it. This needs to be an absolute, because there are no absolutes. We're either trying to get, as perfectly or as close to one or as close to zero. And I think that just perfectly goes with what you just said there.
Yeah, no, it's tremendous. Joshua Crumbaugh, thank you very much for spending this time with us. I meant it, and hopefully you did too. I would love to continue to stay in touch and perhaps have you back on down the road. The folks, as always, I invite you to send your thoughts and comments in. If you have a question for Joshua, be sure that he gets it. If you have any complaints, I'll be sure he gets those too. No, I'm kidding. Really, really tremendous stuff. Thank you again so much.
Thank you. Bye.
We'll see you guys next time. This has been Speaking Of with Steve Weissman, the InfoGov guy, a Holly Group production.